Hi, how are you? And welcome to another podcast by George. Well, we just kind of cycle around to politics. I kind of hit on it when it's necessary or when it's topical, and it's all topical right now. It's what everybody's talking about, and it's still the aftermath, the fallout of the Mueller report. And we're back in the offices of Dr. Steffen Schmidt. He's the Lucken Professor of Political Science here at Iowa State University. He's the author of 11 books, including the best-selling college textbook, the one that they use here and damn near everywhere, I think, American Government and Politics Today, 19th edition. It's been read by more than 3 million college students, so this guy has some influence. Dr. Schmidt obtained his Ph.D. from Columbia University in Public Law and Government. He's the recipient of numerous teaching awards. And he's known as Dr. Politics to his many readers, followers, friends, and fans worldwide. He's a frequent commentator on national and international news media, and he's a friend of Podcast by George, and I'm glad to have him back and glad to have this opportunity to talk politics. And so let's start with the Mueller report. I'm driving up here to do the interview today, and I'm listening to NPR, and it's all they're talking about. It's still on there, and they're digging into the details and trying to work around the redactions and trying to find something, I think, still trying to find something that reinforces Russiagate, and in lieu of that, something that would reinforce an obstruction of justice charge.
Yes, and I'm pleased to be obviously again on Podcast by George. It's terrific to be talking with you. The Mueller report was the bread and butter and the life stream of most of the American media for 2 years.
At least.
More than 2 years.
Yeah.
And their fantasies about what Mueller was discovering, because he was quiet and never talked about what he actually was finding, the people that he brought in to testify, the people who were actually charged, convicted, and some of them prosecuted and jailed on peripheral things, usually having to do with tax evasion and all kinds of things that were not directly related to the Mueller mission, which was Russian interference in the American elections and their support of the Trump campaign to make sure that he became president. The fantasy was that when he finished the report, there would be a definitive smoking gun. There would be that incontrovertible evidence that the Russians had directly worked with Trump and the campaign, and therefore that there was essentially a violation of campaign laws and other American laws in the 2016 election. And when the report came out, the succinct summary of it that the Attorney General Barr provided said, well, Mueller really didn't find that. And Congress and the media and the Democrats said, well, Barr works for Trump, and he has distorted the Mueller report, and he is summarizing it at the expense of the truth. So now the report comes out, and it's redacted, and there are lots of things crossed out, so we don't know exactly what those are. But the gist of the thing, and, I rarely read 400 pages. It's just too much, is that, there are all kinds of improprieties. It's clear that the Russians for years have been meddling in American society, not just elections. But as you discover that, you find that had nothing at that point before Donald Trump even had a wet dream about becoming a candidate for office. That was Russia's effort to sort of weaken the United States. And Barack Obama himself, as your listeners know this, was made aware by the intelligence agencies that Putin was interested in meddling in the United States. And Barack Obama said to Putin, cut it out. He said to Putin, you are doing bad things. You're invading other countries and doing other stuff, so we're going to put sanctions on you. So the Russian interference has a long history in the United States, and the Mueller report confirms that history extended into the campaign of 2016, and that Vladimir Putin really did not want Hillary Clinton to become president.
Well, I mean, that's clear. Well, what do you think about the fact that some folks are saying we were attacked by the Russians? That was an attack. I've heard some people go so far as to say, some of the national observers, we're at war. That was by Russia. And other people say, what, they did some stuff on Facebook? It doesn't seem that serious. It just doesn't seem to rise to the level of an attack or a war on the United States or our political system or our electoral process.
It was not war, and I hate talking about this because it seems like I'm apologizing for Putin, but the United States, for years, has supported the opposition to communism in Russia. The United States had something called the Voice of America.
Sure.
The VOA.
Right.
And the VOA was the precursor to the internet, because it didn't exist then.
Remember Radio Free Marti?
And yes, and
Yeah.
Radio Free Europe.
Right, yeah.
Radio Free Europe. And what did they do? We had huge staffs broadcasting information to opposition groups in Russia and Hungary and Poland and the communist countries.
Cuba.
Yeah, in Cuba. And we applauded it and said, we are a democracy and we're going to help spread democracy and we're going to make sure that Russia changes and that the people like Putin don't dominate it. And we pushed that on and on and on into the Obama administration, and the Russians finally shut down a lot of those operations that were going on in Russia. You know, there are these institutes that we've set up in Washington, the National Endowment for Democracy and others like that. And a lot of those are funded by dark funds and CIA and other funds that are basically funneled into these organizations to spread regimes around the world that are friendly to the U.S. And the Russians have always resented that, you know, and said, you know, you're interfering in the internal affairs of Russia. And so now all of a sudden they're tweaking our system and exacerbating racial tensions and doing Facebook and Twitter and Instagram and other platforms to enhance the divisions that we already have on gender, on sexual orientation and other things, because they feel that that's an appropriate thing to do. And yes, it's inappropriate. Yes, you know, we should not be happy with it. But war? Really?
Yeah.
It's not war. It's
silly talk. It
is. It's international propaganda and efforts basically to expand the sphere of influence by information technology at this point. And so when you read the Mueller report, it's clear that Hillary Clinton's hard line towards Russia and towards Putin really annoyed the government of Russia. The sanctions that were imposed over what Putin considered to be perfectly legitimate control over territories that had been part of Russia, where the population was mostly Russian, really, I think, was the reason why when she became the candidate, the Russians increased their efforts to expose some things about the Clinton campaign and the Democrats that might look bad.
Well, those hacked emails, supposedly, quote unquote, hacked emails from John Podesta's email account that revealed some embarrassing and detrimental things to the Clinton campaign.
Yes.
That probably is one of the more serious allegations against the Russians. But at the same time, I recall that James Comey said that those emails probably weren't hacked, that they were probably delivered, that they probably came on a thumb drive, and that's how WikiLeaks got a hold of them. And if that's the case, it wasn't internet hacking, it wasn't Russia, it was somebody inside that would have delivered those emails. That was a very key phrase that he used.
Yes, and the nice thing that we now have is the ability to spin every kind of conspiracy theory that you want to come up with.
Yeah.
And it'll sound right. It'll sound like, oh, yeah. Of course, there was another shooter on the, down on the hill there in Dallas.
That a bullet that disintegrated.
That's
and nobody
right.
It
was a bullet made out of ice.
John
F. Kennedy was not killed by Hink. No. Yeah. This now, becomes folklore. The Democrats are trying to figure out if they can squeeze some stuff out of that will undermine or embarrass Donald Trump. In his campaign.
So there's an immediate pivot. So Mueller report comes out, Russiagate. There's a saying down south, that dog won't hunt. Bill Clinton used it. In this part of the country, farmers used to say, and this is an old saying, Abraham Lincoln used it, but that plow won't scour, is the other saying. Right. So Russiagate is that way. I forget about it. It ain't happening, at least from Robert Mueller's perspective. Pivot immediately to this obstruction of justice angle. Now, when they look at that, I'm listening a little bit because people, this is the way that I've heard it described. Richard Nixon, big trouble, small crime. But the bigger crime was trying to cover it up, was the obstruction of justice. That's what really brought down the Nixon administration.
It did, definitely. I mean, his effort to shut down the special prosecutor and fire him and those were the crimes. But
can Trump, does that look the same way to you?
Well, I think the Democrats might be hoping that, that's what will happen.
Because it's a bigger crime, much bigger. It has to do with Russia's involvement in our elections or this hacking and all, as opposed to a break-in at the Watergate. Right. So the obstruction is for a bigger crime, which makes it a bigger deal, maybe.
Proving obstruction, then would have to come from some testimony in the House. And President Trump has told all of his people, you are not going to testify. No matter what kind of subpoena you get from the House, don't testify. So that, to me, is the more interesting development in the last few days, which is, is that constitutional? The Congress has the right to subpoena and have people testify. And for a president to basically prohibit that, is serious business. Now, you got to remember that there is a Senate, and if there's any action taken against President Trump, the Senate would have to be essentially willing to work with the Democrats in the House, and I don't think they're going to do that. So impeachment, you can impeach and charge the president in the House with certain crimes and misdemeanors, and then it's dead because the Senate isn't going to convict him and isn't going to remove him. That's pretty clear.
Happened with Clinton.
Yeah, it happened with Clinton. And we've never impeached or removed anyone that way. So where are the Democrats going with this? In the meantime, they're missing all the opportunity to build a credible brand on the issues that are tops on the list of American voters. And that is, number one, healthcare, number two, immigration. Most Americans are worried about large numbers of people coming illegally into the U.S. The Democrats have literally no coherent policy on illegal immigration. The only policy they have is we're not going to build a wall, and that's not a policy. And so the Democrats, I think, are wasting valuable and precious time in going in a direction that I think is going to be a dead end. In the end, it's going to be a dead end.
Well, what about my friends, our friends in the news media? The same thing applies.
Yeah.
I mean, Russiagate, they got egg on their face, I think. Didn't work out, didn't look good.
Yes.
You've got what used to be considered kind of left-wing media. If you take the CNN and MSNBC and those folks, they all got in bed with Jim Clapper and John Brennan of these CIA spooks that would never be considered friends of the left.
Yes.
And they helped create this Russiagate conspiracy thing that has failed. And so now they're pivoting to the obstruction of justice thing, which, like you say, may be a dead end also. Well, and where are they going to be when this is over with?
And the question is, which part of the last 2.5 years constitutes obstruction, and that has to be proven. And then once it's proven, how are you going to implement it? How are you going to enforce it? And what does the House do to react to the fact that they're not going to get people coming and answering subpoenas and testifying? That they don't have a law enforcement arm. The House of Representatives doesn't. That's President Trump's. Law enforcement is the Department of Justice, the FBI, and the federal marshals and the Secret Service. And if you say, well, we're going to punish you if you don't come and testify, it's like the Pope once condemned Stalin, and Stalin asked, how many divisions does the Pope have? And the answer was none, really. How many divisions does the Congress have? None.
None, yeah.
The Congress does not have a law enforcement arm. And so, this to me could be just a gridlock while the Democratic campaign machine grows like some giant fungus, with more and more fungi appearing on the scene, many of them of very dubious presidential quality. And in the meantime, Donald Trump has $100 million or more already in a campaign war chest, and is basically already running for his reelection, which he has been doing since the day after he got sworn in, which is when he declared he was running, I think. And so, this is a real problem, because the Democrats are so divided, not only in terms of the diversity, which is wonderful, that there are so many different Democrats with different characteristics, but also a worrisome thing because who is the leader of the Democrats? Right? It's, Barack Obama, as the former president, should be, but he's very quiet. He hasn't really done much. And when people say, why are people still supporting Trump? My answer often is because they don't know which Democrat is going to be the candidate for president and whether they can swallow that particular candidate. And there are some that the voters just are not going to accept. And the Democrats, George McGovern ran as a progressive. He was the first candidate that I met in Iowa when the modern Iowa caucuses were put in place.
Yeah.
And George McGovern was terrific. And he was a wonderful person. And he had all kinds of great progressive ideas. He got basically defeated by one of the greatest landslides in the history of this country. Whether things have changed, everybody says now the Democratic Party is much more to the left and liberal, and Americans are much more progressive. And I'm saying be careful, because that's what it seemed like at the time with the Vietnam War rolling and George McGovern offering all these solutions, and it didn't work out. So the Democrats have a challenge to pick someone who can inspire enough people that they'll go to the polls and Donald Trump will not get the 270 electoral votes. And that's their mission. And I think today they're failing in that mission. The temptation for every Democrat alive with a pulse to declare that they're going to run for president is so great. And there is no party discipline and no leadership.
Well, and there's an elephant in the room here in the state of Iowa particularly, and I talked to Kirsten Gillibrand, and I'm going to have that podcast up very soon. I asked her about this specifically because she looks like she's carrying the flag for Hillary Clinton.
Yes.
I mean, she took her seat.
Yes.
She wants to be, she's big on the feminist issue, wants to be the first woman president. She wants to uplift women, and that's all good.
Yes.
But the elephant in the room, particularly here in the state of Iowa, is the divisiveness, the split between the progressives that feel that they got screwed with their candidate, Bernie Sanders. And that wasn't that long ago, 2016. Right. They're still sour about that.
They're still hurting.
Yeah. And the mainline Democratic Party that feels that the insurgency of the progressive movement, Bernie Sanders, cost them their first female woman Democratic, Hillary Clinton.
Yes.
So they're sour. So these two sides are still not happy with one another, and that's your Democratic Party issue. That's the elephant in there.
I gave a talk to a wonderful group of Iowans recently, and my point was that one of the front runners on the Democratic side is not a Democrat. Bernie Sanders is not a Democrat.
Right.
He's not. He's a Democratic Socialist or an independent, depending on, the day of the week. But he's not a Democrat. He's running as a Democrat, but he's not a Democrat. So the Democrats have, in a sense, a real serious problem because they are being penetrated by socialists. And the socialists are saying, no, we're Democrats, and the whole Democratic Party thinks like we do. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez in New York is basically an apprentice of Bernie Sanders, and she also is a Democratic Socialist. But in that district in the Bronx, that works really well.
Sure.
That's a really liberal district, But is that where a majority of the people that I know who are Democrats who have gone to caucuses and I've met with since 1970, are they going to support, someone with a package of democratic socialist ideas? I don't know. They may support a part of it. They may support a greatly improved health care plan for the country that is either, universal health care for everyone, which is a huge leap, or a great re-engineering of the Affordable Health Care Act. But then when it comes to some of the other things that are being marketed by, let's say, Bernie Sanders, I'm not sure if those voters then can stay on board. He's got too many ideas popping out at the same time. And yes, it is very fair and just and a patriotic thing to let people who are in prison vote. But, he's going to get really clobbered by the Republicans and by conservatives and by law enforcement and others for saying that even if you're in jail for life for murder and on death row, you should be allowed to vote. I'm not sure that's going to, fly with people who are interested in other issues and want to hear about those more than this.
Yeah.
This is going to be a fascinating year, and we probably should share with your vast listening audience the fact that I'm skeptical that any Democrat will get enough delegates by Super Tuesday, which is basically after the Iowa caucuses and New Hampshire primary, to go on then to the Democratic Convention and get nominated on the first ballot and get nominated with a majority of the delegates. I'm very skeptical. I wrote an article about it, and Texas and California come so close after Iowa and have such massive numbers of delegates. Something like 38% of all the delegates will already have been chosen by the time Super Tuesday is over, California and Texas and some other states. That'll be a brokered convention, and that will be incredibly interesting because it means they will go to the convention, all of them carrying a package of delegates, and they'll have to negotiate with who those delegates will flock to and finally give a majority to, and I don't know who that is.
All right, so did I hear that correctly, that it takes 50, you have to have over 50%, a candidate has to get that to get it in the first
of delegates, yes.
Yeah, in the first round. If it doesn't, it goes to the super delegates. They have a huge role in the second round.
Yes.
And when I think of super delegates, I think if you've ever been to a caucus or any of these meetings, these are the old folks. These are the people that have been around for a long time, that are deeply involved in party politics. They wouldn't be super delegates
or elected
otherwise.
Officials, they're elected officials,
yeah.
A lot of them, and some of them are frankly not so old. And let me put it this way, some of the older Democrats, especially if they come from the prairie part of the U.S., can be pretty darn progressive. Yeah. They can vote for a black guy called Barack Hussein Obama. So I don't worry as much about the superdelegates undermining the will of the people because, they got elected. They became leaders in the party for a reason. And the reason is that they did well in politics. But yes, they will be there, and they're maybe more likely to be more middle-of-the-road Democrats than Bernie Sanders or, some of the progressives.
Yeah.
But then when you look at the team that is running out there to be nominated, there are a lot of sort of people who are middle of the road as well. And there is the most middle of the roader of them all has just declared that he will run, and he's the guy on top of the polls competing with Bernie Sanders for first place, and that's Uncle Joe Biden, the vice president. I've heard a lot of nasty things said about him recently. There are a lot of Democrats who think that somebody his age shouldn't be running, and someone who has a very mixed record, with Anita Hill hearings where he really beat up on Anita Hill when she was there on the Clarence Thomas Supreme Court confirmation, and that he touches women too much and so on. So it's going to be wonderful. It's going to be nasty. It's going to be mudslinging, tomato throwing, and it's going to be just like American politics was at the beginning of the Republic, the election of 1800, one of the nastiest elections between Thomas Jefferson and Adams in the entire history. I just wrote an article on that. Yeah.
Well, hopefully we won't have any public dueling or anything like that.
That would be wonderful. We have a lot of guns, so public dueling is
wouldn't that be great?
Yeah.
That'd be entertainment. That'd get some ratings, wouldn't it? That's a reality show for you.
As long as it's a single shot pistol, that's fine.
Alexander Hamilton and Aaron Burr.
Yeah.
That'd be great. Well, now I got to come down on Joe Biden a little bit.
Sure.
My point with him is this guy is considered to be, maybe in the United States of America, the authority on foreign affairs, at least on the Democratic side of the legislature. They think he's a brilliant man. He's Secretary of State, Vice President of the United States, knows everybody everywhere, knows everything. Voted for the Iraq War.
Wow.
Yeah. And I look at that and I think, how can a guy that's supposed to be that knowledgeable vote for the Iraq War? Obama voted what? Not president? I think, if I remember correctly.
How did Hillary Clinton vote?
She voted for it.
Yeah.
And she's all knowledgeable also.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So maybe they knew something.
Well, that's the bad news.
Or maybe they didn't.
Yeah, that's the bad news. I mean, the way that I look at it. So I look at Joe and I don't know, Joe.
Yeah.
I mean, it's going to be hard to get my vote when you vote for the Iraq War.
Yes.
Yeah. And talking about war, this is something else I wanted to get in because I don't hear a lot of talk about this, at least at this stage of the game. You mentioned health care, big issue. Most Democrats get that. They understand that. Immigration, they're not dialed into too much. The other thing that I think is a big issue is the military-industrial complex thing.
Yeah.
And they're intertwined. Healthcare, we can't afford it. Well, part of the reason we can't afford it is our budget is so heavily allocated towards the military.
Yeah.
I just heard that our military budget has increased 40% since the Iraq War.
Yes.
That we have allocated $2 trillion to the improvement or upgrading of our nuclear weapons stockpile, our nuclear weaponry. Yeah. So is that really necessary in your opinion? Do we need to be spending that kind of money to upgrade nuclear weapons?
I don't know too much about nuclear weapons, but I know that we had a slow decline in the readiness of the U.S. military. The world is not becoming much safer as we go along, and the Chinese are certainly trying to become the dominant power, at least in the Pacific. And Vladimir Putin is on a major arms buildup and expansion of the capability of the Russian military in Europe, and the Europeans are very worried about that. So my answer to you would be, if the United States wants to remain the defender of the democratic world and contribute defense to that, I guess you got to upgrade your military forces. You got to do it without cutting taxes on rich people and others so that you can fund it. And I think that's a bigger problem. I mean, we could easily afford, the upgrades of the military if we just didn't do it with deficit spending. And with borrowing money and having the Chinese basically bail us out by buying government bonds so that we can do that. And that is something that I think has to be discussed, and the Democrats are trying to have a discussion about that because, when we were the greatest power in the world, wealthy people in this country had a marginal tax rate of 91% at one point. And they didn't complain about it too much because they could still live really well. And the decline of the progressive tax has choked revenue to the government for infrastructure, for creating and maintaining a military that is reputable and modern, and for doing all the other things that, we expect the government to do, and that only government will do because private companies aren't interested because it's a loss leader, not even a loss leader. It's just, something they don't want to invest in. The attack on the federal government and this whole thing about the deep state and how bureaucrats, are there to do bad things, to me is a real disturbing thing because it plays right into the hands of the adversaries of the U.S. because it's our government and it's doing all kinds of things. When it isn't performing, we have outbreaks of food poisoning and diseases and other things because we're not investing enough in keeping the house clean and orderly.
Yeah.
And that's something I don't understand.
I don't
understand how Americans cannot understand that we have to have food inspection. We have to have the NTSB to check on accidents and make sure that they fix whatever caused those accidents, or to have research on diseases, better vaccines, and so on, which government tends to have to fund universities to do all that stuff. We're just sort of slipping backwards on all of that. And, that I think is the thing that disturbs me the most. And I don't understand how Republicans can be happy with the kind of federal deficit and national debt that we're building up. All of a sudden, they've changed their mind. They are no longer restrained on it, and they, really are in a sense allowing us to become a second-rate country, which is a great shame.
Yeah. I think the thing that I hear over and over is that when Clinton was in office, when he left office, we had deficits, but the budget was balanced. Was that what the situation was? Or
well, we did have a balanced budget at one point, yes, but that's unusual. Since the beginning of the Republic, and when my students, I hear a lot about this, about deficit spending and so on, and borrowing, and I tell my students, well, we've always borrowed. The American Revolution was financed by the French.
That's right. Yep.
And we, took that and borrowed it and fought the war and then paid it off. And so it's been very rare that we have a balanced budget. Bill Clinton had one only because there was a .com bubble in the tech industry where companies suddenly erupted that were doing all kinds of stuff on the internet and were worth billions of dollars and paying taxes.
Yeah.
Those were all fantasies for the most part. Those companies all disappeared. And now the marginal tax rate and the corporate tax rate in particular is not implemented well. And companies like Apple and others don't pay any taxes, which is extraordinary and interesting. And Americans seem to be okay with it, which is odd. Those companies move their financial headquarters to Ireland and other places where they don't have to pay taxes. And there's not much discussion of it. You go to the mall and there you don't hear people talking about that.
It's not a hot button
topic. It isn't at all. Yeah. Where do we get the money to keep running the government?
Yeah. Well, let's leave it there. I think you really you hit on it. As a matter of fact, I tell people that I talk to sometimes that I think the biggest disagreement in America is, do you want your government to focus on running around the world and killing people, basically, to keep you safe?
Yeah.
Or do you want the government staying at home and doing the things that the government can do, like health care social programs.
Yeah.
And
the answer is always going around the world and killing people.
Yeah. It seems to be that way.
Yeah.
And the other thing about it is, I heard a guy say, everybody wants small government. Don't criticize the government, because if you look at America, it's the only thing that we do collectively.
Yeah. Yeah.
And there's value in that. Otherwise, we're all just a bunch of John Waynes walking down the street with a pistol strapped to our butt. I mean,
Yeah.
you need the government to collectively survive.
The other thing that just to wrap up is that you got to remember that defense spending is almost all of it spending domestically. We don't buy a lot of military stuff from other countries. We make it here. We engineer it here.
Yeah,
we have an enormous industry that makes airplanes and ships.
And every elected official has a company doing
their
that in their district.
Oh,
and the effect on politics
Absolutely.
cannot be. Well, and Dwight Eisenhower saw that coming.
Sure,
Yeah.
absolutely. Yes, Dwight Eisenhower. Gosh, I haven't heard that name for a while. I think he was a Democrat.
Yeah, today he would
But
be. He'd be a left-wing Democrat today, probably.
When he decided to run, that he pretty much, he didn't toss a coin, but he made an arbitrary decision to run as a Republican. Did you know that?
I did not know that.
He thought about running as a Democrat.
Yeah.
He ran as a war hero.
Sure.
So he didn't really need a party label, but
Well, those were different times.
we need somebody like that who doesn't have bone spurs.
Yeah. And now we got a guy with bone spurs that gets elected.
That's right.
Well, that's great. Well, we're going to come back soon because, like I said, this is a whirlwind of politics that's going on, and it's not going to subside anytime soon. We got the Iowa caucuses now. What? About 9 months away?
Yeah, they're coming. I can smell them.
Yeah. That's so stay tuned and come back and listen in. But for now, that's another podcast by George.